In the apocalypse, everything will change. Prepare for the hazards of survival with Zombucks, currency of the apocalypse, before it's too late.
Hey everyone, welcome back to AMTV. I'm Topher Morrison. Obama asked the Supreme Court for warrantless cell phone search powers. But the real question is, what does a crack dealer, an intrepid journalist, and a revolution have in common? The Washington Post reports the Obama administration has asked the Supreme Court to rule that the Fourth Amendment allows for warrantless cell phone searches. The case in question, U.S. versus Worry, dates back to 2007 when a Massachusetts crack dealer, who after being arrested had his cell phone searched. What police found ultimately led authorities to his house, where weapons and more drugs were seized. The crack dealer was initially convicted, but on appeal, the First Circuit Court held that the police should have gotten a warrant before accessing any information on the man's phone. The Obama administration disagrees, arguing the First Circuit's ruling conflicts with other rulings at appellate court levels and the Supreme Court itself. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires any warrant to be judicially sanctioned and supported by probable cause. Dealing crack cocaine, unfortunately, in an age of prohibition, is probable cause enough, and during an arrest, police are likely to confiscate your property. As the Post Timothy Lee notes, quote, "The government contends that a cell phone is no different than any other object a suspect might be carrying. But as the storage capacity of cell phones rises, that position could be harder and harder to defend." The Fourth Amendment holds primarily that it is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. University of San Diego law professor Donald A. Dripps, in a recent article, reminds us that America inherited a common law tradition from Great Britain prohibiting such random acts of invasive power. Additionally, Dripps, citing Boyd, an 1880 Supreme Court decision, contends that the court rightly held that papers, specifically, deserve more constitutional protection than effects. Now, the reason for that is, during the 1760s, King George's abusive writs of assistance, or general warrants, authorizing royal agents to carry out wide-ranging searches of anyone, anywhere, and any time, regardless of whether they were suspected of a crime, were fresh in the minds of the founders during the drafting of the Constitution. But Dripps argues that the Fourth Amendment's prohibition wasn't necessarily absolute. After all, stolen, contraband, and papers of evidentiary value can be seized during arrest. He advocates regulated, discriminate, and non-rivalrous processes for inspecting documents, a far cry from the indiscriminate, expropriating, unregulated, and inquisitorial seizures endorsed by the king, features of which many argue parallel today's dragnet NSA surveillance regime. In other words, when police arrest you for selling crack, there unfortunately isn't a regulated and discriminate set of rules and regulations akin to Miranda warnings when it comes to seizing your digital information. In other words, guidelines and safeguards stipulating what the police can and cannot have access to within your phone. It's a device which today is inundated with emails, text messages, photographs, application, and browser histories, among a multitude of other sensitive and personal information. The NSA doesn't even broach the idea that there may be a distinction. So as often is the case, the rule of law is far behind the speed of technological innovation, and new structural safeguards ought to be constructed. The only question is, how will that occur? David Snyder, writing for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, notes that events in 1760 led to the writs of assistance playing a starring role in the prologue to the American Revolution. The Paxton case, in particular, in which James Otis, a prominent local attorney, argued the writs of assistance totally annihilate the freedoms of one's house. Arguments which inspired a young John Adams, who later wrote of Otis, "Then and there was the first scene of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there the child, independence, was born." A second event which added revolutionary fuel to the fire was the case of John Wilkes, an English newspaper publisher who fought against the writs, but this time it was across the pond in England. Wilkes had criticized the king and other high officials in his newspaper, the North Briton, to which His Majesty, notes Snyder, ransacked 5 houses, arrested 49 people, broke down 20 doors and trunks, and broke hundreds of locks in the process. The press in England and America had a field day, to which the courts ultimately condemned the warrants. Both events played midwife to our Fourth Amendment. There are countless analogs in the digital age to those violations back in the 1760s. But how does the crack dealer, the intrepid journalist, and a revolution have to do with each other? Over the weekend, David Miranda, an innocent man and partner of Glenn Greenwald, who broke the NSA super scandal, was detained for 9 hours at Heathrow Airport. Greenwald, like Wilkes, publicly criticized the British and American governments and their secret courts and suffered clear intimidation for it over this weekend. British intelligence in Georgian fashion also attempted to destroy hard drives at the Guardian newspaper where Greenwald works. The same thing happened to John Wilkes over 200 years ago. The crack dealer is not unlike Edward Snowden, who traffics victimless products, which bring attention to injustices, albeit through dubious means. The revolution? Who's to say when or if a revolution will occur? But it was only 10 years prior to 1776 that mass royal dragnets swept throughout the country. The intimidation of media, enforcement of unlawful decrees, and a nascent freedom movement on both sides of the political spectrum were all ingredients present prior to the American Revolution. The fallout of recent events may have yet to be fully realized. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe, like, and share it with your friends and family. Follow me on Facebook at The Real Topher Morrison and on Twitter at AMTV News. Check out my other videos here. If you really liked our stuff, we're asking for your help to keep us independent by donating $5 a month to Alternative Media. Thank you for watching.